Hi, and welcome. I thought it might be useful, given the challenges that we're facing at the moment around the world with the coronavirus, to have a discussion regarding the Bible principles in relation to dealing with tragedy, tyranny, and malevolence. Not surprisingly, the Bible has a great deal to say about dealing with trial, and trials often come in different forms. Sometimes they come through tragedy. Sometimes they are the result of tyranny, and sadly, sometimes they are the result of malevolence. Hopefully, you never experience malevolence in your life, and hopefully, you never experience tyranny. But there is a good chance that you might experience tragedy. I know a number of my friends and colleagues and business people that I've worked with in the past are very concerned about what's happening in the world today, particularly in relation to the challenges of being locked down by governments who are trying to protect the public from the spread of disease, and the implications that that has for their businesses, and for their families, for their welfare. And so I thought it might be opportune to spend a little while, briefly, talking about these three challenges, these three concepts of tragedy, tyranny, and malevolence as they're presented in the Bible. Solomon makes an interesting point in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. He says that it's better to go to the house of mourning than it is to go to the house of laughter and joy. Now you might think that Solomon has rather a dark view on life, but he makes a very powerful point. Most of us at some point in time are going to have to spend some time in the house of mourning. We're going to experience tragedy. We may experience tyranny, and in some circumstances, we might even experience malevolence. Solomon's point is that we should be educated by going to the house of mourning. He makes the point specifically, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living may learn and take it to heart. It's challenging to have to consider our own mortality. It's challenging to have to consider the mortality of our loved ones. But tragedy comes in varying forms and shapes. Good things happen to good people and to the evil. As Christ himself says, it rains on the good and it rains on the evil. Likewise, bad things happen to the good people and bad things happen to evil people. Another example is the example of Elisha. Elisha prayed that God would create a famine in the land of Israel for 3.5 years. He prayed that it might not rain. Now, 7,000 of his fellows had not bowed the knee to Baal, and they suffered along with the many who had bowed the knee to Baal. What's more, Elisha himself suffered. He had to be fed in a creek by ravens, probably not his preferred option. And yet, he prayed that that famine might occur to turn the hearts of the people back to God. So, trials occur in our lives, but for the believer, the objective of the trial is that we might learn, and that we might grow, and that we might develop spiritually. So I thought we might take this opportunity to consider 3 stories from the Old Testament, which provide us with insight and comfort when it comes to these 3 concepts. But first, let's define a few ideas. Firstly, the idea of tragedy. Tragedy often comes as negative events in our lives. Often we feel as though we are unsuspecting actors. We feel that we haven't contributed to the tragedy. A situation has arisen for which we've had very little to do, very little impact on. And that is hard to deal with. But tragedies happen, and we've got sufficient experience and sufficient stories to comfort ourselves when faced with tragedies. Tyranny, on the other hand, is related to negative events that occur due to imbalanced environmental factors. Maybe these external forces that are operating in our environment, which create negative consequences for ourselves and for our families and for everybody else. Malevolence, on the other hand, is a rather terrifying concept. Malevolence are negative actions that others have targeted for us. For some reason they hate us, for some reason they have decided that we are the object of their rage and hatred, and they seek our demise. Now, humans generally cope with tragedy. They rebel against tyranny, but when faced with malevolence, we really, really struggle. You may have done absolutely nothing to have earned this person's rage and upset, and there may be nothing you can do to change the circumstance. The Bible provides us with examples of each of these three challenges through the lives of men and women of faith. So let's look firstly at this idea of tragedy. At some point in time, we're going to be faced with the horrors of tragedy. We might lose somebody important to us, somebody close to us. We may experience a situation in our lives where a business fails, we lose our job, or perhaps we lose our health. These are serious tragedies, and they have significant impacts, not just on ourselves, but also on our families. Arguably, one of the best examples of tragedy in the Bible is found in the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, for the best intentions, chose to leave Israel, leave the area of Judah, and go to Moab. He lived in Bethlehem, and he moved into the foreign country, Moab itself. The reason for him to move was because they were facing famine. They were facing a tragedy. And so, quite reasonably, they decided that they would try another place, a place where there was sufficient food to provide for their welfare. Sadly, the outcome itself was tragic. Elimelech died, and his two sons died, leaving three widows, Naomi, Ruth, and they had to make a decision about what they were going to do. Would they stay in Moab or would they leave? Rather than staying, Naomi decided that she would return home. Here are some lessons that we find in the book of Ruth. When faced with tragedy, you can't stay. You need to progress. When faced with tragic circumstances, you need to move. You need to find a support network that can support you, familiar friends and family, and familiar places. But equally as important, you can't stay in grief town. You need to get past it. Certainly you need to grieve, no doubt about it. You have to grieve, but you can't stay there. You need to move forward. You also need to take committed team members with you. You need to rally your immediate support network. Naomi had Ruth, and Ruth wouldn't leave Naomi's side. Together they would get through this. You need to get busy. Wallowing too long in grief can result in serious mental illness and additional issues and challenges. Ruth didn't go to Israel and then do nothing. She got busy. She got up every morning and went and worked in the fields to provide food for herself and Naomi. We need to have confidence that God will provide us with opportunities. Ruth stumbled into Boaz's field. Now, if she hadn't have got up in the morning and gone seeking the welfare of her mother-in-law and herself, she would never have been presented with that opportunity. If she hadn't paid attention to her mother-in-law, she wouldn't have been able to take advantage of the hospitality and later the enduring love of Boaz, who she later married. When faced with tragedy, we need to move, we need to surround ourselves with familiar things, we need to take committed people, and we need to act and take opportunities. If we don't act, the opportunities will not arise. I was once given a very wise piece of advice in my business career. A coach once said to me, "Justin, luck occurs when preparation meets opportunity." Ruth prepared herself, and then she took the opportunity. Let's turn our consideration to tyranny. We may be unlucky enough to experience tyranny. In fact, in some respects, we experience tyranny every day. We're all trapped in bodies that are dying, and there's very little we can do about that. And yet, there are some key principles presented for us in the Bible in respect to how to deal with tyranny. Hopefully, we don't experience systematic tyranny. Hopefully, we don't experience nepotism in the office. Hopefully, we don't experience the angst and the upset of government officials. But those things do happen from time to time. Another excellent story which talks about this idea of tyranny is found in the book of Daniel. Daniel was the victim of tyranny. He was taken out of Israel as a captive and sent into Babylon as a slave. He was made a eunuch and he was forced into the education system of the Babylonians. Daniel, however, didn't give up his principles. What are the lessons from the book of Daniel? Firstly, Daniel didn't adopt the system of tyranny. He didn't allow it to impact him. In fact, he let it wash over him. Just because you're a victim of tyranny doesn't mean you have to give up your principles. Daniel set his heart to live by principle. He set his heart to serve his God. Later in life, living by principle would have him thrown to the lions. However, he would be freed and saved from that experience. One of the things that you will find when you encounter tyrants is that they respect people of principle. Now, sure, they may select against you, but they will respect those principles. Daniel was careful to pick his ground. He chose what fights were worth fighting and what fights weren't worth fighting. For example, Daniel didn't object to his name being changed. He didn't make it about himself. However, he refused to take the daily portion of the king's meat. There's an interesting and powerful principle behind this. Israel was fed in the wilderness daily a portion of manna, a portion of bread from heaven. That bread from heaven represented the doctrines, the principles, and the word of God. Daniel wouldn't give up the principles of God for the philosophy of the Babylonian world. He rejected it. And it guided him throughout his very successful life and his very successful career. Daniel made the best of what was on face value a very bad decision, a very bad circumstance, or a very bad set of circumstances. Despite the terrible situation, Daniel chose to work as a public servant for the king, and he became very, very successful. Just because you may be encountering tyranny doesn't mean that you can't progress. It doesn't mean that you can't succeed. After all, Daniel converted Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the world. But he didn't give up his principles through that process. Lastly, let us consider malevolence. Malevolence is a very, very hard thing to deal with. If somebody sets their mind for no apparent reason to make your life miserable, to seek your demise, and perhaps even your destruction, it's a very hard thing to deal with. It's a very hard thing to cope with. A good example of somebody who had to encounter and deal with malevolence was Joseph. Joseph was an honest, hard-working young man who loved his father and sought the benefit and the welfare of his family. He sought to protect their reputation. Sadly, for Joseph, he was born into a terribly dysfunctional family. If you read the story in Genesis of Jacob and his 2 wives and 2 concubines and his sons, you can quickly see how much of a terrible situation that family was in. Constant bitter infighting, constant hatred, examples of murder and immorality. Being a good person surrounded by bad people, Joseph quickly became a target of his brother's hatred and his brother's ire. His brothers deliberately set out to harm him, and they took opportunity wherever they could to make him miserable. We find that they sought to kill him initially, but then thought better of it and decided they could make money out of his sale into slavery. And so they sold a young man, probably 16 or 17, into slavery and into Egypt. And for the brothers, that was the end of it. There are a number of important lessons out of Joseph's life. If you're being faced with malevolence, the best thing you can do is get out. Don't stay in a situation where you can be attacked and victimized by the malevolent actor. As terrible as it is to be sold into slavery, better to be sold into slavery than to have to etch out a terrible life in fear of your life with malevolent actors. Malevolent actors can't be reasoned with. They have no logical reason for which they hate and persecute you, and they will pursue your demise with aggression. Best not to be there. In some respects, Joseph being sold into Egypt actually saved his life. Joseph stuck to his principles. Despite the fact that he was a slave, despite that he was sold into Egypt, he didn't become bitter and twisted. He stuck to his principles and he lived by those principles. He would not compromise his personal morality for opportune scenarios. He rejected Potiphar's wife's advances and held himself clear, even though it resulted in him being sent to prison. Joseph was industrious. As a slave, he couldn't personally benefit from the hard work that he might undertake. Having said that, he wasn't prepared to compromise. He wasn't the type of person to slack when the boss wasn't around. He wasn't the type of person to take opportunity and steal when his boss wasn't looking. He worked hard, and because he was industrious and because he worked hard, he was promoted within the slave ranks and actually headed up the house. He became essentially the manager of the household of Potiphar. Despite being sold into slavery, despite being sent to prison, Joseph helped others. He didn't become bitter, even though he had spent time as a slave in Potiphar's house and he was now in prison. When faced with opportunities to help others, he took those opportunities. He helped the baker and he helped the cupbearer. Certainly, some of his advice wasn't welcome, but the fact of the matter was, he could have chosen not to get involved. He could have chosen not to be supportive of the activities of the prison, and yet he was. In fact, we find that when he was elevated by Pharaoh, the tyrant of his day, he didn't become bitter. In fact, when he even became the most powerful man beside Pharaoh, he didn't become a tyrant himself. He worked hard to save the Egyptians, and he worked hard to preserve Pharaoh's kingdom. Joseph would educate. We find in the story of Joseph that his brothers come down seeking for grain. Now would be the opportunity for Joseph to wreak his retribution, to get his revenge on his brothers. He could easily have had them thrown into prison as spies. He could easily have had them beaten and killed, but he chose not to. Not because his brothers didn't necessarily deserve it, but that wasn't the type of person Joseph was. We find in the chapters of Joseph's life and his interaction with his brothers an interesting development. He seeks to educate them. Certainly, he wasn't easy on them, but his objective was to save them. Of all his brothers, Simeon was the most violent. We find that Simeon is the ringleader going against Shechem in an earlier story. Joseph imprisons Simeon for probably a year, maybe more, while his brothers went back to Jacob to retrieve his brother Benjamin. He said to his brothers, "You can't get any more grain unless you come back with this other brother of yours, this Benjamin. And to ensure that you do come back, I'm going to imprison your brother Simeon." Now, Simeon had a lot of time to think about his evil ways. Simeon would have thought, well, if it was up to me, I wouldn't come back for me. And no doubt Simeon was very, very concerned about his welfare. We also find that Judah develops as a person. Judah was the money-hungry brother. He suffered his own tragedies. He left the family and sought to attach himself to a wealthy Gentile, married his beautiful daughter, and yet things went very, very poorly. His wife died, and God went out of his way to kill his sons because they were wicked. More tragedy. And yet Judah becomes a selfless individual. He takes upon himself to protect Benjamin. He says to Jacob, "If I don't bring him back, let it be on my head." Despite all the tragedies and all the tyranny and all the malevolence that Joseph had experienced, he didn't let it harden his heart. He forgave his brothers. When he was presented with them, he could have destroyed them, and yet he chose to forgive them. And lastly, Joseph had a vision of God's purpose with him. He saw through all the tragedy and all the malevolence and understood that God was working with him to bring about his family's salvation. "God sent me ahead of you to save you," he said to them. "Don't be afraid. Bring my father down." And so Joseph provided for the welfare of his brothers and his brothers' families and his father and his mothers and his relations. Joseph didn't understand early on why he had to be the victim of malevolence, but he was confident that God had a purpose with him. When we're faced with tragedy, or when we're faced with tyranny, or perhaps when we're faced with malevolence, as believers, it's important that we put our trust in our Heavenly Father, that He is there for us and that He will save us. That there is a bigger purpose, a broader purpose with our lives than just the tragedy and the challenges. It's important for us to remember the lessons from the Word of God, that we need to stick to our principles, that we need to be industrious and hardworking, that we need to protect our hearts from becoming hardened, that we need to be prepared to teach and prepared to forgive, that we need to surround ourselves with familiar faces and comforters and a committed team, that we need to continually hold fast and show forth the principles of God. I hope this short talk has been helpful in these trying times.